It is my pleasure today to tell you about our speaker. So, how can we build capacity in our communities to convene dialogues that will increase empathy? And it's such a much needed trait today and so critical for having vibrant and healthy communities. So that's one of the stated goals of the traveling Smithsonian exhibit, The Bias Inside Us, that the JCC is hosting, and in partnership with Rotary, I might add. Our speaker, Laura Zelle, who is zooming in from Minnesota, will tell us more about the creation and the impact of this exhibit. As project manager for it, she will be here in person on February 21st, setting it up, where it runs from February 22nd to March 22nd. This exhibit is grounded in research and is showing in museums, universities, and schools across the country. The Smithsonian Learning Lab offers curriculum, resources, and interactive lessons for schools, communities, and workplaces to inspire them to be more inclusive. In addition to her project manager role at the Smithsonian, Laura is also the director of content for the new app, Emissary for All, working to combat anti-Semitism and hate. It's my pleasure to welcome Laura Zelle to Rotary. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you to the Boulder JCC, Joy and Jonathan, for hosting this for your community. I'm going to share my screen, I believe, to get started. So I just want to take, I know I have to talk fast, so I'm going to talk fast. And I'm going to just walk through why we chose implicit bias, the creation of the exhibit, and it's been on the road for 4 years, and I'll talk a little bit about that and a little bit about the origin story. But basically, we wanted to start with the idea that we're all born with bias. It's part of being human. It's an innate trait. It happens automatically in our brains. And we wanted to keep this thesis at the core of our approach to the design, to the sections, to the education. But we really knew that we needed a strong group of partners to talk about this on the road and to get some funding behind it. So a little bit about the origin story. Can you guys see my screen okay? Okay, super. Got a thumbs up. Thank you. This has been over 8 years in the making. It started with a lay leader. I was director of Holocaust education at the JCRC in Minneapolis, and a lay leader came to me and said, "How do we take Holocaust education on the road?" And I thought to myself, that is not something I want to do. That is the worst idea ever. Holocaust education belongs in a controlled environment, in a 9-week course, teaching teachers, teaching students at, college level or high school level. And so I just really didn't know which way to turn until I went to my friend who's on my, at the top of the screen, my friend Joanne Rizzi, who's here at the Science Museum, who developed an exhibit called Race, Are We So Different? And together, the two of us really started to brainstorm about, okay, it's not going to be just Holocaust education. That's not enough. That's not the umbrella where we could bring a lot of people in under. And so we started talking to national advisors. We started to raise some money locally, and we did not really have much of an idea at all when we ended up pitching to the Smithsonian. Believe it or not, 18 months later, they said, "Come on, let's talk about this." And the first thing they told me to do was to find my advisors. Excuse me. So when that happened, I went and talked to the gentleman at the bottom, who is my cousin, Dr. Corey Yeager. He was getting his PhD in marriage and family therapy at the University of Minnesota and was studying Dr. Benagi's work around implicit bias. And, 2.5 hours later, after our first conversation, he handed me Dr. Benagi's book, which was called Mind Bugs, and said, "I think you can bring a lot of people into this conversation if you are able to disarm them, don't put them on the defense, and start to talk about how we all have this." And we took his words and decided to build an exhibit that could travel the country. So we set off to raise $2.5 million, and really start to build out a flexible framework for communities. We wanted it to be in non-traditional spots. We didn't want this to be a conversation that could only happen behind museum walls, behind a ticketed price. And we also wanted to lend support to the local communities. So in addition to bringing the practitioners and the advisors and Dr. Bernaggi's team to DC to talk about this, we also set off on what's called a proof of concept around the upper Midwest, gathered communities, gathered artists, gathered principals, high school students, middle school students, teachers, and asked them a ton of questions. Ask them what's going on in your community. What would you like to build on? What should the Smithsonian provide? What should it look like? And we learned some really important lessons along the way. One really important thing was that people do not want the Smithsonian coming to town with with telling them what to think. Bring people in with multiple touch points, with art, with poetry, with lived experience, and let it be accessible to where they are in their own journey, and also recognize the work that's going on locally. So here's a quick list of where the tour has been for the last 4 years. It is free of charge to communities, including an additional community support. And around the country, just real quick, in Jacksonville, Florida, at the Mosh Center, the Museum of Science and History, here are some examples of community programs. They've done poetry. They've done a lecture on voting rights. They engage with the Native community. In Wisconsin, they showed movies and had a book talk, brought in Dr. Calvin Lai, tapped into the theater scene and the poetry scene. So it's really looked different around the country, but they wanted to make sure that we had the foundation of the science front and center to be able to build on it. So just real quickly, we've done a ton of evaluation along the way. And we needed to prove to our funders that we would accomplish our goal. And so the last summative evaluation, we asked the question, did your awareness build? Did it increase? Walking through this exhibit, did you walk in with more awareness? Because in fact, that's the first step in breaking down your own implicit bias. And so you can see here that we definitely hit the mark. Some people were in the a lot, some were in the some. That's okay, we'll take it all. So at the core of the experience walking through the exhibit is we wanted to make sure that, like I was saying before, our shared humanity was centering the conversation. And so we wanted to make sure that people walked in and weren't on their defensive. This isn't one group talking to another, putting another group down. This is basically a storytelling that can get revealed through video. We had a national call out to people giving us their experience living with bias. We found artists and poets around the world, but we knew from our talks with communities and talks with Harvard that we needed the science to lead. We knew that we wanted to talk about what we all have in common, which is our brain and how our brain functions. And so we decided to start with the science of bias. In this section, we introduced the idea of mind bugs. We introduced the idea of conscious thought and unconscious thought. And we begin to set the groundwork through Harvard's research on how it shows up, how implicit bias shows up, and I'll get to that in a little bit, and how it shapes our attitudes and behaviors. Going forward a little bit more into the exhibit, you'll see a brain model. You'll see a little bit about gender inequities. You'll see things about microaggressions. And on the top right, we decided we had such rich conversations with the researchers and the philosophers that are doing work around this, that we wanted to bring that experience into the exhibition itself. And so there's two very big, large screens where you'll hear Dr. Charlesworth and Dr. Kwame Apaya discussing bias and how it grows in societies throughout time. It's fascinating. And we also built an accompanying website where other of their excerpts are housed as well. Then we get into a section called Bias is All Around Us. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure happened in the exhibit is that it was interactive, it was bright, it was open, and through the interactivity, we were able to focus on product and design and how bias can get weaved into how we experience the world. This is one of the examples, which is the automatic soap dispensers that we now see in many, many different restaurants and airports. And some of them don't recognize dark skin. And it is a simple example of a bias that can come into design. And in fact, when we were talking about and researching different products, we were all together at the Science Museum in St. Paul, and my counterpart Joanne went in to use the bathroom, and she said, "Laura, see?" And she's African American, and the soap wasn't coming out. She actually had to put up a piece of white paper under the soap dispenser in order to engage with it. So she says this happens all the time. We have a bunch of different examples to kind of show you interactively what happens. Another place that we wanted to stop, or we wanted visitors to stop and take a moment to think and to check and to recognize that they might be bringing their own biases into a situation, and was in this video interactive called Should I Speak Up? And I encourage you to take some time. It showcases scenarios. It's in a poetry out loud coffee shop, and there are different scenarios that happen between these friends, and it gives the viewer an opportunity to pick what they would say in response to when they hear something biased, something racist. Do they speak up at all? And what are other people maybe thinking along the way? And so to bring some awareness to the interaction that happens between people. So continuing on with some poetry, we feature photography by a Spanish artist. Her name is Angelica Das, and she was doing some incredible work around labels, around color, and her photography exhibit is in the, her photography work is in the exhibit. And on the right, you'll see that is the large screen is where we had people talk to us about living with bias. And there's about 8 different selections. And people really tap into scenarios where they're maybe perceived as their intersectionality comes alive, let's say. They're perceived on the surface one way when they really hold a different identity on another level, and how people are really quick to judge. So moving forward, these are some other snapshots from our website. I encourage you to go on there. We talk about body image, we talk about banks, we talk about education, loans, who's more likely to get a loan, what happens at doctor offices. This is our learning lab, which is a big resource for teachers in K-12 education. And now I'm going to take just a few more seconds, because I know I need to move it along, to talk about mind bugs, because it's really at the core of what we're teaching in the exhibits. So mind bugs are really the idea of visual or optical illusions and tricks of the eye. So you may, in fact, have seen this particular trick before. Please be patient if you have. I'm going to just walk through it for a little bit. So in this illusion, you look at these 2 orange circles, and you can't help but see them as different sizes. I do. The orange circle on the left simply looks smaller than the one on the right. And yet, when we remove the context, okay, of the blue circles around them, we remove the illusion. So removing the context, we can now judge the 2 equal objects as equals, right? There's nothing sort of in the way. The extraneous information, once it's moved away, it allows us to be more accurate about the judgments that we're seeing. So this draws us to the conclusion that you're not always aware of what goes on inside your own mind. And if you're not always aware of your own thoughts and your own feelings, or how you're perceiving or judging the world, then maybe your mind is playing tricks on you sometimes, And maybe it would behoove all of us to pay attention to when that happens and not be defensive, but actually just pay attention to it. So if you're not always aware of how context and how surroundings affect you, they may be irrelevant, they may be unhelpful, and they begin to shape your expectations. And these expectations become mind bugs, which Dr. Banaji and Dr. Charlesworth were instrumental in developing the IAT test, which some of you might be familiar with, which began to measure these automatic firings in our brains. And I'm running through this super fast, and I would encourage all of you to read Mind Bugs. I would encourage all of you to go on the IAT test on Harvard's site if you want to look or want to learn more about that. So as we're walking through this, the research used to explicitly ask people about their biases. And the big move that Dr. Banaji did was to develop this IAT test to uncover this implicitness that we don't even understand when it's happening. And so because she was able to do this, the findings that I'm going to simplify this a lot now, but the findings that they came to were 4 of the important findings that we decided to put into the exhibit. So first of all, they taught us that implicit bias emerges very, very early in childhood. So babies and children are infinitely curious, and they begin right away to look out into the world and to notice patterns, notice associations. And from these rapid associations that fire in their brain, they begin to develop beliefs and preferences about the world and about people. For instance, Harvard teaches us that as newborns, babies who are listening to their native language in the womb already show a preference to listening to that language outside of the womb. So at just 3 months old, babies already show maybe a preference for the gender or the race of their primary caregiver and the people that they're surrounded by. And so the takeaway really is from the moment that we're born, we're curious to understand the hierarchies and the beliefs in our world. This is really a real thing that we all try and sort out. And implicit biases are embedded in this world, and they leave what Harvard calls an imprint on our brain. And so it begins to affect our attitudes and our actions and the way we design and think about things. The other thing that another key finding that their research showed was that it's shockingly widespread. So they told us that every single country in which they ran the IAT, they found preferences and that implicit bias was everywhere. And although it doesn't look the same throughout the world, it doesn't look the same. It often differs in different places. But really what this is telling us is that it's not solved by just rooting out a few bad apples, that rather it shows up in all of us. And it's not just about pointing our finger at a couple of people and saying, oh, they're the problem. The third important finding from our study of implicit bias is that it doesn't just sit around idle in our mind, rather that it is actually active in our mind. And as I've talked about before, it shapes our behaviors. So we may be in our behaviors or our attitudes, it may come out in how you look to hire people, resumes that you decide to bring people in for interviews, mentorships, how you trust people, preferences that you have for different groups. And just to go to a positive, whoops, I went a little too fast through that, is that they did find that actually our implicit bias can be changed. And just to leave everybody on a more of a positive note is that even though it's widespread, even though we all have it, even though it's automatic, that we can be in somewhat control of interrupting it, checking it in others, and changing both ourselves and systems. So, for example, let me go to the example that they use often is in middle school classrooms. They did a in-depth research on the environment that was set up in middle school classrooms around science. And so the cues on posters that they had communicated that scientists, either like the image on the bottom right, they work in isolation, they were mostly men, maybe socially awkward. And they did a test of this controlled environment versus the same environment where the science posters were actually about the science, that they weren't about stereotypes of who was conducting the science, but that they were actually about the science, the periodic table, elements of space. And they found that by removing the popular media posters that activated the stereotypes, and that they were able to intervene into the biases that were firing among the young girls, and they were actually able to interrupt the consequences of implicit bias in that classroom, because it wasn't becoming internalized, like the young girls didn't belong there because they didn't see themselves there. And so it's just a small social nudge. One of the reasons that they like to use this example, and I like to use this example, it's because it's not expensive to change, right? And it is changing a system within this classroom in a very simple way. Bigger things to obviously work on are the social movements, the legislative actions, the systemic change, all of these that we all build with our own biases, and that we can, through education and through getting to know other people and through becoming aware of your own mind and how implicit bias works in your own bodies, and really recognizing that this does happen and it is part of being human, is being able to then influence the world around us. And so by our simple thesis throughout this exhibit is, if we can increase our own awareness, we can change our minds and our practices and contribute to building a better world. So this is the last slide I'm gonna stop on, which is our poster set. And we just thought that the universal message of bias is human is a great way, a great example of building an environment for classrooms, that teachers can have these free of charge from the website. And so I'll bring some with Joy when I come to Boulder next month, and so we can distribute them to people that would like them. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thanks so much for speaking to our group. My question concerns a little background first. I grew up Jewish in Atlanta, Georgia, and I experienced a great deal of conscious and unconscious bias. The main conscious bias was against the African American community. The unconscious bias was against my Jewish culture in Atlanta. So in unconscious bias, I wanted to separate it between negative and ignorant. So people aren't always intending to hurt you with unconscious bias, for sure. And I want to flash forward to the October 7th terrorist attack. And at that time, Israel reacted really strongly, as you know. And there were protests in colleges and universities around the country. And so I went through a whole new round of conscious and unconscious bias. I didn't call it anti-Semitism, I called it deep insensitivity to my culture. So my question concerns actually recent executive orders, two in particular. One sanctions government agencies that discuss unconscious bias in any way, bring it forward in their workshops and what they say in their publications and so on. And the other sanctions students and colleges that do not sanction students, especially international students, who protest the Gaza war and the Israeli reaction to it. And I wonder how you and your organization is carrying forward in the face of these government sanctions.
An amazing question and very timely because I just got the executive order in my email yesterday. I am very much wanting to be clear that I am not an employee of the Smithsonian, that I'm a contractor that was hired 8 years ago to do this work. The Smithsonian is informing me that there are some meetings that are happening next week, and that it's going to be a deep dive into what will be allowed and what will be not allowed. And there is a real threat to removing funding from the Smithsonian through this executive order. I, personally, I don't know where to begin. My whole work has been around teaching about anti-Semitism, understanding Jewish identity on one side, and then participating in DEAI efforts, interfaith, intercultural alliance on the other side. So my whole career is in this zone. And I have been in many, many conversations over 25 years, roundtables, presentations like that, like this, where really getting down to like the definition of what anti-Semitism is really important for people. And this education is so important for people. Understanding, I come out of the public school world, understanding the students in your classroom, right? Their cultural identity, their traditions, their family structure. All of that is completely opposite of what is happening through this executive order. So personally, I can speak like that. Professionally, on behalf of the Smithsonian, it is a wait and see to see what will happen with the education around the bias inside us and the rest of the national tour. We started this tour during the first Trump administration. And before we could even put the show on the road, we had to go through what's an internal review. And I remember being on a Zoom call, and there were 14 lawyers from their general counsel department at the Smithsonian going through every word we put forth on the panels, on our website, in our educational material. And I just, well, I appreciated that review. It was a lot to really talk about something that I feel personally, as a Jewish woman in this work for 25 years, we need to talk about more. So did that answer your question? It's a really difficult time. And if I didn't, please ask another one, because I'm happy to continue to clarify.
Thank you so very much. This is so incredibly timely right now. Even since the executive orders came out, we are now being told that hateful, biased positions are just, quote, common sense. It's in the last 24 hours. And I expect that we're going to run into people within the community who justify their biases as common sense. Do you have a thought about how we can respond to this sort of thing? I think what you're saying is bias is common. That doesn't make it common sense. But I'm just wondering how you would recommend that we reply to that sort of thing.
Yeah, I would lean into the science. I would just lean into the science. And that's why we start with that scientific section about how our brains actually absorb. You know, we get 11 million messages like every minute, and we're not possibly able to absorb all of those on a conscious level. And so a lot of how we begin to absorb things is in an unconscious way. And I would lean into the science. Harvard has online, I feel like it's called Unpacking Human Minds. I might not have the exact title right, But that is why we decided to put the science section big and first, and it is grounding in why this is okay to talk about it, how we all have it, and you can't debate that we all have this in our brain.
Thank you for coming here today. I have kind of a different question. I have kids, and one of the things we struggle with our kids is trying to distinguish between judgment and bias and racism and the negative connotations versus kind of the practical application of judgment in certain situations. We travel the world. When is it okay to make determinations based on what you see about a person for your own safety, for when you don't walk down a street, when you don't go in a certain neighborhood, compared to when is it an exercise of unfair bias? I struggle with kind of drawing that line for my kids when I travel, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I mean, I think, the more your conversation can be that we all can be comfortable talking about when our biases show up. They all show up, whether they're negative, positive, they're going to show up. And it's how we talk about it. I mean, you sound like, you're amazing parents in that you have opened up this conversation, right? When does it cross a line into harm? When does it cross a line into dangerous stereotypes? When does it cross a line into microaggression? And that we are going to have to be able to have the trust within, let's say, your family or my friend group or my family to talk about it and to check each other, because it's a part of being human and it's a part of the human experience, right? And that the more harmful thing is to label, well, I'm not gonna say always, sometimes, to just label somebody a certain label. You're an anti-Semite because you said this. You've now divided, right? You've divided and labeled people, and it's less likely to have conversations that might be revealing about what led you to believe that, about understanding your own mind and your own thoughts and how they influence your behaviors a little bit better. So there isn't like a clear line like you've crossed, unless I would say you're causing harm, harm without evidence. I know that can be subjective, but just keep talking about it. Just keep disarming, keep the conversation in a place that let me show you what I thought about today that revealed my biases towards somebody. I mean, that bringing down the defensiveness and bringing that awareness is really the important step that we all need to take. And so it sounds like that's what's happening in your family, which is amazing.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, everybody. I'm Catherine Bourne. I am a member of JCC I'm trying to figure out where to look. This way? JCC in Skokie. And I work at AbbVie, the biopharmaceutical company. And so to frame this as a question, I'm working with the National Science Foundation. Our grant is on the rocks right now because we are one of those people who get our grants. And also at AbbVie, we have a lot of DEI, and I love the way you talked about bias, and we talked about, for Black people, technology that doesn't work. And our stance at AbbVie is that diversity in clinical trials is not a DEI issue, it's just good science, it's good business. How can we all start working together, everybody who's been impacted by these executive orders, and all work together and kind of row in the same direction? So like, how could AbbVie work with the Smithsonian, work with JCC, work with Rotary clubs? How can we all work together to kind of do a unified push? Because if everybody goes alone, we're just too small. Jews are alive today because of allyship, not because we have the numbers. We're a very small group. So anyways, that's my question and thoughts, and thank you for letting me attend.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. You have an incredible opportunity through Joy and Jonathan's work with bringing this exhibit to the Boulder JCC. In other communities, they have hosted business roundtables, They have hosted community events in this space. They've taken the time to debrief around the fundamentals that you'll see in the exhibit to really talk about the question that you just asked. How do we make this alive? How do we make this work in our community? And so I would encourage that space. I would encourage coming out of the exhibit to organize, enjoy. I know we've talked about this before, but they found it really, really successful, like, half-hour debrief. It doesn't have to be something super formal or overly planned, but really begin to listen to people around the question that you just asked. So I would say use the exhibit. I'd like to say use the resources. You can go to the website. The Learning Lab is behind an educational training wall for K-12 educators, but there's plenty of resources on the website. And just to go one step further, I think you asked about how you could partner with the Smithsonian. There isn't really an arm of the Smithsonian to do this, to lead the work in communities, right? That it really is about providing an educational exhibit and platform to discuss these issues.
Wow, thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
Wow.
It's a lot, and it's a lot right now. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to coming to Boulder next month.
We look forward to having you here. Thank you for informing us about the development of the bias inside us, and particularly for going into such detail on the science that informs the exhibit. And I believe, and as these folks know, based on my own experience working with in a terrible situation immediately after the wars in the former Yugoslavia, bringing Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks together, this was the science that made that process work of them forming real friendships after such a terrible war. It was all about the bias inside us. And so we just so appreciate having this exhibit that we will be able to partner with you as Boulder Rotary Club and our Peace Building Committee, and so excited that this science, we believe, will enlighten and be valuable to all those who experience it. And in your honor, and again in thanks, great gratitude for you taking the time to be with us today. First, I need to inform you that after 35 years of working, of Rotary working with its partners to eradicate polio, we're getting really close. And we want to honor you and thank you by donating 100 doses of polio vaccine to the polio fund. And again, just say thank you so much.
That's amazing. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.